The Grand Chamber of the Valeri High Synod did not merely house the representatives of 1,000 star systems. It entombed them in the crushing weight of their own desperation. The architecture itself was designed to intimidate, a soaring dome of obsidian and woven light that mimicked the galactic spiral. Yet tonight, the vastness of the room felt less like a monument to governance and more like the interior of a dying lung. The air was recycled, scrubbed of impurities, yet it carried the phantom scent of ozone and scorched flesh, a psychosomatic plague that had infected every mind present since the first reports from the Rim worlds began to bleed into the capital. High Chancellor Calith sat upon the dais of whispers, his multifaceted eyes dull, the iridescent scales of his thorax graying with the stress that had become his only companion. He looked out over the sea of delegates, species ranging from the gelatinous, intellect-heavy Ult to the chitin-armored warrior caste of the Zethar. Usually this chamber was a cacophony of conflicting agendas, trade disputes, and border friction. Today the silence was absolute, a physical pressure that pressed against the eardrums, broken only by the hum of the central hololith that dominated the center of the floor. The image suspended there was not of a trade route or a star chart, but of a slaughter. Calith's mandibles clicked softly, a nervous tick he could no longer suppress as he watched the recording again. It was grainy, reconstructed from the sensor logs of a dying frigate in the Antares sector, but the resolution was sufficient to convey the horror. The enemy, the Void-born, a scourge of biomechanical nightmares that had consumed 3 sectors in as many cycles, swarmed over the ruins of a Zethar fortress world. The Void-born were endless, a tide of black metal and weeping flesh that knew no fear and offered no quarter. But the camera did not focus on the Void-born. It focused on the thin line of silver and gray that stood against them. The humans. The Synod had petitioned the Terran Union for aid 3 standard months ago, begging for their intervention. When the human fleet arrived, the Synod had been underwhelmed. The ships were blocky, utilitarian, lacking the elegant curves of Valeri aesthetic or the organic flow of Ult bioships. And their soldiers, the soldiers seemed small, soft, encased in primitive composites, wielding kinetic weaponry that relied on chemical explosions rather than directed energy or plasma. The Council had sneered, privately believing they had traded their treasury for a primitive mercenary force that would be swept aside in moments. But the recording showed otherwise, and that was the source of the fear that now paralyzed the room. The recording showed the Terran line infantry, the common, standard-issue soldiers of their rank and file, holding a breach against a force that outnumbered them 100 to 1. The footage zoomed in, stabilized by the dying ship's AI. A human soldier, helmet cracked, armor pitted and scorched, stood atop a pile of rubble. He had lost an arm, the cauterized stump was still smoking. In his remaining hand, he held a kinetic rifle, firing with a rhythmic mechanical precision that defied biology. He did not scream. He did not retreat. He simply killed. Next to him, another human, this one dragging a wounded comrade with one hand while tossing a suppression grenade with the other, moved with a fluidity that was terrifyingly efficient. They were not fighting with the glory of the Zethar or the philosophical detachment of the Valeri. They were fighting with a cold, industrial malice. They turned war into a calculus of attrition, trading blood for time, lives for meters. The footage ended as the orbital bombardment began, the humans calling fire down on their own position to deny the enemy the ground. The hololith flickered and died, plunging the room back into the dim ambient light of the stars. Calith felt a shudder ripple through the assembly. The Zethar War Master, a creature twice the size of a human and bred for combat, rose slowly from his podium. His voice, usually a thunderous roar, was subdued, laced with a vibration that Calith recognized as all bordering on terror. "You tell us," the War Master rumbled, his 4 arms resting heavily on the stone, "that these entities are the standard deployment, that these are the grunts, as the translation matrix calls them, the lowest tier of their military hierarchy." The question hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. If the lowest tier of humanity fought with the ferocity of a cornered supernova, what manner of civilization had the Synod invited into their midst? They had feared the Void-born because the enemy was alien, unknowable, and hungry. They were beginning to fear the humans because they were knowable, logical, and impossibly efficient at destruction. The humans did not fight to win, they fought to end. Ambassador Lyra of the Ult, her form contained within a hovering suspension tank, projected her thoughts directly into the minds of the Council, her telepathic voice trembling with a psychic resonance of dread. "We have analyzed their psychological profiles during the engagement. There is no panic. There is no bravado. There is only task completion. When the soldier lost his limb, his cortisol levels spiked for 0.04 seconds before returning to baseline. He applied the tourniquet while calculating the trajectory of incoming fire. They suppressed their survival instinct in favor of mission parameters. This is not courage, counselors. This is pathology. We called for allies, and we have summoned a weapon we cannot holster. The doors to the grand chamber hissed open, the sound startling half the delegates into reaching for concealed weapons. The silence that followed was instant and total. Through the massive archway walked the human delegation. There were only 3 of them. They wore no armor, no ceremonial robes, no displays of rank other than simple insignias on the collars of their dark blue uniforms. In the center walked Admiral Holloway. He was an older male, his hair the color of iron filings, his face a topographical map of deep lines and scars that suggested a life spent looking into the glare of unshielded stars. He did not march, he strolled. His movement was predatory in its economy, wasting no energy. To his left and right were aides, silent and observant, clutching data slates. The contrast between the Terrans and the panic of the Synod was stark. Holloway looked like a man who had stopped by on his way to a light lunch, not a military commander discussing the extinction of a galaxy. He approached the central podium, the eyes of 1,000 species tracking his every breath. He placed a single, leather-bound notebook on the lectern, an archaism that baffled the holographic-dependent council, and looked up. His eyes were dark, devoid of the bioluminescence or cybernetic enhancements common in the room, yet they held a gravity that made Calith want to look away. "High Chancellor," Holloway said, his voice unamplified yet carrying to the furthest reaches of the dome. "The report from Sector 4 is complete. The Void-born advance has been halted. The Antares line holds." He stated it as a fact, not a boast. Calith swallowed, his throat dry. "Halted, Admiral. The reports indicate 90% casualties among your battalions. You lost 40,000 souls in 3 rotations." Calith expected grief. He expected anger. He expected a demand for compensation or a plea for withdrawal. Holloway merely nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "Acceptable losses, Chancellor. The objective was the preservation of the industrial hubs on Antares Prime. The hubs are intact. The line holds." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the Zethar delegation. "Acceptable," the War Master barked, unable to contain himself. "You threw 40,000 of your own kind into a meat grinder to save factories. You speak of them as ammunition." Holloway turned his gaze to the War Master. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "They are soldiers, War Master. They know the math. They stand on the wall so that others do not have to. It is the agreement we make with our own existence." He paused, looking around the room. "However, we did not come here to discuss the line infantry. We came because our intelligence indicates the Void-born are escalating. They are deploying a Class 9 Titan form in the Helios Drift. Your fleets cannot stop it. Our line infantry can delay it, but they cannot kill it." Calith gripped the edges of his podium. A Class 9. The last time a Class 9 Void-born entity had appeared, it had cracked a moon in half and consumed the mantle. "If your standard army, the army that we already fear, Admiral, cannot kill it," Calith whispered, "then we are dead. The Synod has no reserves. We have thrown everything at this war." Holloway's expression did not change, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Was it pity, or perhaps amusement? "We do not require your reserves, Chancellor," Holloway said softly. "The line infantry has purchased the necessary time. We have authorized the deployment of the special forces." The term hung in the air, translated by the universal matrix into various concepts for the different species. Specialized labor, ceremonial guard, technical support. The War Master let out a chuff of derision. "Special forces, what will that do? You send mechanics, diplomats. If your warriors, your Iron Rain as you call them, cannot scratch the Titan, what will a special task force achieve? Repairs." The misunderstanding was absolute. To the Synod, special implied a niche utility, a deviation from the norm of combat. They had seen the common army, the brutality of the standard Marine, and assumed that was the pinnacle of human violence. They assumed that anything special must be less violent, more precise, perhaps political. Holloway smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator revealing that the cage door had been open the entire time. "I believe there is a translation error," Holloway said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a resonant hum that vibrated in the chest cavities of the delegates. "You have seen the hammer. You have seen the shield. That is the infantry. They are the broad strokes. They are the blunt instrument we use when we need to hold the line." He tapped the notebook. "The special forces are not. Support, they are the scalpel. They are the storm that walks. You feared our common soldiers because they die without complaint. You should fear the special forces because they do not die at all. The lights in the grand chamber dimmed, controlled by the human aides. The central hololith flared to life again, this time showing a live feed from the Helios drift. The void of space was filled with the sickening, writhing mass of the void-born armada. In the center floated the Titan, a monstrosity of biological plating and warp engines the size of a small continent. It pulsed with a violet energy that distorted the starlight around it. Against it, the Valeri defense fleet looked like toys. "We have deployed Task Force Chimera," Holloway narrated, his voice calm. "4 operatives." "4," the shout came from the Ult ambassador. "4 ships." "No," Holloway corrected gently. "4 individuals." The chamber erupted in outrage. It was an insult, a suicide mission, a mockery of their plight. To send 4 biological units against a Class 9 Titan was madness. Calith rose to shout him down to demand a real fleet, but Holloway raised a hand. "Watch." On the screen, there was no massive fleet warping in. There was no thunder of guns. There was simply a distortion, a ripple in the fabric of spacetime just above the Titan's primary dorsal ridge. 4 pods, no larger than coffins, materialized from the void, cloaked in stealth fields that the sensor logs struggled to render. They did not decelerate. They slammed into the Titan's hull at relativistic speeds. The impact should have vaporized them. Instead, the hull of the Titan, an organic armor capable of shrugging off nuclear fire, buckled. The view zoomed in, the pods opened. The beings that emerged were humanoid, but they were no longer strictly human. If the line infantry were men and women encased in armor, these were gods encased in technology that bordered on sorcery. They stood 10 feet tall, their armor a shifting, liquid matte black that seemed to absorb the light around them. They did not carry rifles. They carried weapons that hummed with a dark, unstable energy, singularities trapped in magnetic containment fields. One of them, the leader, raised a hand. The vacuum of space, which should have been silent, seemed to scream across the sensor audio feeds, a psychic backlash that made the Ult ambassador shriek and clutch her suspension tank. What are they?" Calith whispered. "The line infantry is recruited from the population," Holloway said, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "They are trained, but the special forces they are forged. Genetic reconstruction, cybernetic integration at the cellular level, neural pathing that allows them to process combat data faster than a ship's AI. They are not fighting the war, Chancellor. They are solving it." On the screen, the violence began. It was not the grinding attrition of the infantry. It was a blur. The 4 figures moved faster than the frame rate of the cameras could capture. One moment they were standing on the hull, the next they were a kilometer away, leaving a trail of severed, void-born limbs and shattered metal in their wake. They did not take cover. They did not suppress. They advanced. The Titan reacted, spewing millions of drone forms from its pores to overwhelm them. The lead operative did not slow down. He simply gestured, and a wave of gravitational force flattened the drones into paste against the hull. Another operative drew a blade made of coherent plasma, and sliced through a blast door 3 meters thick as if it were smoke. The Zethar War Master was trembling. He had spent his life studying war. He understood tactics, leverage, force application. What he was watching was not war, it was an extermination. It was the difference between a man fighting a wolf with a stick and a star-going supernova. "They are barely solid," the War Master murmured. "They phase through solid matter. They manipulate gravity." "How?" "Technology we found," Holloway lied smoothly, though everyone knew it was a lie. "Technology we made, technology we became." The 4 operatives breached the Titan's core. The feed switched to their internal suit cameras projected onto the massive dome of the Synod. The interior of the Titan was a cathedral of flesh and gears, pulsating with a malevolent intelligence. The void-born defenders here were elites, massive war forms that had slaughtered entire Valeri battalions. The humans, the special forces, walked through them. One operative took a plasma bolt to the chest. He didn't stumble. He grabbed the attacker by the head and crushed it with one hand, the sound of breaking bone audible through the conduction sensors. They spoke to each other, not in tactical commands, but in a language of encrypted bursts that sounded like binary static. "Target Alpha located. Core integrity 90%. Initiating intersection." "Confirmed. Reality anchor disengaged. Going loud." "Going loud?" Calith asked, horrified. "What have they been doing until now?" "Stealth," Holloway said. The screen turned white. When the visuals returned, the core of the Titan, a heart the size of a city, was gone. In its place was a void, a perfect sphere of nothingness where matter had simply ceased to exist. The four operatives stood on the edge of the crater. The Titan, its heart ripped out, began to scream, a psychic death knell that resonated through the warp. The massive ship began to crumble, its biological components withering as the central intelligence died. The entire engagement had taken 4 minutes. The Synod sat in silence. The fear they had felt for the line infantry was a candle compared to the bonfire of terror that now consumed them. They looked at Holloway, really looked at him, realizing that the pleasant, tea-drinking diplomat represented a species that could distill apocalypse into 4 soldiers. "The Titan is destroyed," Holloway said, closing his notebook. "The Void-born fleet is breaking formation. Our line infantry will mop up the remnants. The special forces are returning to stasis." Stasis, the word slipped from the Ult ambassador. "They cannot exist in normal space for long," Holloway admitted, a rare moment of vulnerability. "They are too much for reality to hold. They sleep between wars. We only wake them when the equation cannot be balanced by conventional means." Calith realized then the true nature of the alliance they had struck. They had thought humanity was a young, scrappy race with a large army. They were wrong. Humanity was a jailer, and their special forces were the monsters they kept in the basement, leashed by ethics and discipline, waiting for a reason to be let out. The Synod had provided the reason. We thank you," Calith stammered, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "This victory, it is unprecedented." "It is not a victory, Chancellor," Holloway said, his face hardening. "It is a delay. The Void-born are not invading, they are fleeing." The twist hit the room like a physical blow. The silence was shattered by 100 voices asking the same question. Fleeing? Fleeing what? Holloway signaled his aide, and a new image appeared on the hololith. It was a star chart of the galactic rim beyond the territories of the Void-born. There in the deep dark, stars were going out. Not one by one, but in clusters. Something was moving in from the intergalactic void, something so vast it cast a shadow across the constellations. The Void-born, the nightmare that had terrified the Synod, were merely the rats running from a burning building. "We interrogated the Titan before its termination," Holloway explained, his voice grim. "The Special Forces have a unique capacity for neural interfacing. The Void-born are running from the silence." "The silence?" the War Master asked. "A construct," Holloway said. "An ancient machine intelligence that prunes galaxies. It has arrived." The Council was paralyzed. They had just witnessed the apex of their fear, the Void-born destroyed by the apex of their new allies, only to learn that both were insignificant compared to the shadow on the horizon. Panic began to set in, a rising tide of hysteria. "Quiet," Holloway said. He didn't shout, but the command snapped across the room like a whip. "The line infantry cannot fight the silence. The fleets cannot fight it." "Then we are doomed," Calith said, slumping in his chair. "If your special forces, your gods, cannot stop it." "I didn't say they couldn't stop it," Holloway interrupted. "I said we need more than soldiers, we need unity." He walked to the center of the room, standing amidst the holograms of dying stars. "The special forces are not just weapons, Chancellor. They are the proof of what biological life can become when it refuses to yield. We were once like you, afraid, divided, looking at the sky with terror. But we looked into the abyss until the abyss blinked." He looked at the Zethar War Master, then the Ult ambassador, and finally Calith. "The Void-born ran because they are slaves to their biology. We are not. The humans you fear, the infantry, the special forces, we are just the vanguard. But to face the silence, we cannot do it alone. We need your resources, we need your fleets, we need your minds." "Why?" Calith asked. "If you are so powerful, why do you need us?" Holloway's face softened, and for the first time he looked tired. "Because the special forces lose their humanity to become what they are. If we fight this alone, we will become the very monsters we destroy. We need you to remind us what we are saving. We need you to be the civilization we are too busy defending to practice." The revelation settled over the chamber. The fear of the humans shifted into something else, a complex, heavy gratitude mixed with wariness. The humans were not conquerors. They were the shield-bearers, the ones who had voluntarily walked into the fire so that others could sit in the light. They had weaponized their own souls, mutilated their own genetics, to stand between the candle of life and the hurricane of the dark. Calith stood up. He looked at the terrifying image of the extinguishing stars, then at the small, gray-haired man who commanded monsters. "The Valeri fleets are yours, Admiral," Calith said, his voice steady. "And the Zethar legions," the War Master added, pounding his chest. The Ult Mine Cloud pledges its processing power, the ambassador chimed in. Holloway nodded, and a faint smile touched his lips. Not the predator's smile, but the smile of a father watching his children finally understand a difficult lesson. Then let us begin, Holloway said. The silence is coming, and I think it's time we introduced it to the noise. The camera pulled back, through the roof of the Grand Chamber, up through the atmosphere of the capital world, past the orbiting defense platforms, past the gathered armadas of a dozen species, out to the edge of the system where 4 black ships sat in the dark, silent and waiting. Inside them, the special forces slept, dreaming of electric sheep and the taste of stars, waiting for the order to wake up and kill a god. The galaxy was vast and dark and full of terrors. But for the first time in 1,000 years, the Council did not feel alone in the dark. They had the humans, and the humans had the monsters, and that, Calith thought as he engaged the war protocols, would have to be enough. The transition from the High Synod to the tactical reality of the Helios drift was jarring, a shift from cool, filtered air and diplomatic doublespeak to the raw, radioactive vacuum of a war zone. The wreckage of the void-born Titan drifted in an expanding cloud of debris, a metallic nebula of blood and shattered alloy. Amidst the ruin, the flagship of the human expeditionary force, the UNS Indomitable, hung like a dagger suspended in oil. It was an ugly ship by galactic standards, brutalist, angular, designed for firing arcs and armor slopes rather than aesthetics. But to the eyes of Commander Vance, leader of the Line Infantry's 7th Drop Regiment, it was beautiful. Vance stood in the observation blister, watching the recovery shuttles flit back and forth. His armor was off, revealing a body mapped with the history of his service, synth-skin patches, older jagged scars, the port at the base of his skull for the command uplink. He was tired. His men were tired. They had held the line for 3 days against a force that didn't sleep, didn't eat, and didn't stop. They had done it with kinetic slugs and grit, bleeding for every inch of the asteroid belt they had been ordered to defend. And then they had arrived. Vance had seen special forces before, but only from a distance. The Tier 1 operatives, the ghosts, the rank and file called them the Ascended. There was a superstition in the barracks that you didn't look an Ascended in the eye, or you'd see your own death reflected back. Vance didn't buy into the mysticism, but he respected the lethality. Commander. Vance turned. Admiral Holloway walked into the blister, holding 2 cups of something steaming. Coffee, real terrestrial coffee, a luxury that cost more than Vance's yearly salary on the black market. Admiral, Vance snapped to attention, but Holloway waved him down, handing him one of the cups. At ease, Vance. You and your boys did good work down there. The Synod is impressed. Vance took the cup, blowing on the steam. Impressed? They looked ready to orbital strike us themselves when we first landed, thought we were barbarians. They still think we're barbarians, Holloway chuckled, looking out at the stars. But now they think we're their barbarians. It's a subtle distinction, but a useful one. Vance took a sip. It was bitter, hot, and perfect. The Ascended, the Special Forces, they cleared the Titan. In 4 minutes, Holloway confirmed. Vance shook his head. Took my regiment 3 days just to hold the perimeter. Makes you wonder why you even keep us around, sir. Holloway turned to face him, his expression serious. We keep you around, Vance, because you are human. The Ascended, they've given up a lot to be what they are. They don't feel fear. They don't feel hope. They just calculate. If we only had them, we wouldn't be fighting for anything. We'd just be machines fighting other machines. He gestured to the fleet gathering outside, the alien ships falling into formation alongside the human vessels. The Council is scared of the Special Forces, but they understand you. They saw you bleeding. They saw you saving your squad mates. That built the bridge. The Special Forces just cleared the road. The intercom buzzed. Admiral, priority signal from the Chimera 1. The operative wishes to speak with you. Holloway tapped his comms bead, put him through. The voice that came over the speakers was not entirely organic. It sounded like stones grinding together, layered with a digital chorus. Admiral, the silence has adjusted its vector. Explain, Holloway said. The destruction of the Titan sent a ripples. The silence has noticed us. It is accelerating. Time to intercept has dropped from 6 months to 6 weeks. Vance felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air recyclers. 6 weeks, he whispered, to prepare for an intergalactic threat. Holloway didn't flinch. Understood, operative, return to stasis. We'll wake you when the music starts. He cut the connection and looked at Vance. "Well, Commander, it looks like your leave is canceled." "What's the plan, sir?" Vance asked, setting the coffee down. "The plan," Holloway said, "is to take this new alliance, this fragile, terrified council of aliens, and forge them into a hammer. The special forces will be the tip of the spear. But you, the infantry, the fleets, you're the shaft. If the shaft breaks, the spear is useless." He looked back out at the stars, where the shadow of the silence was growing. "We're going to teach the galaxy how to fight, Vance. Not how to kill, they know how to do that, but how to fight. How to stand when common sense says run. How to spit in the eye of God and tell him to blink." The screen faded to black, but the story continued in the minds of the trillions who watched the broadcast. The humans were no longer just the mercenaries from the outer rim. They were the glue holding a crumbling galaxy together. The common army was the body, resilient and stubborn. The special forces were the spirit, terrifying and transcendent. And together they stood at the gates of the coming night, ready to burn. Somewhere in the depths of the Indomitable, in a cryobay shielded by 3 meters of lead and inscribed with warning sigils in a dozen dead languages, the 4 pods hissed. The frost on the glass melted slightly as the internal heaters cycled. Inside one, a hand twitched. It was a hand of black metal and pale flesh, 6-fingered and clawed. The mind within drifted in the void of data, watching the enemy approach. It did not feel fear. It did not feel bravery. It felt only the cold, hard certainty of purpose. The silence was coming, and the human special forces were the answer to a question the universe hadn't dared to ask yet. The galaxy held its breath. The war for everything had begun.